Okay, so is everybody all powered up from lunch? Right? Everybody always says after lunch they kind of get that afternoon snooze, but we're going to try to keep you awake. So I'm Maria Palombini with the IEEE Standards Association. If those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, and most of our work in the Standards Association is obviously standardizing technologies to make them easily interoperate and drive adoption. So if all of you have a cell phone, we have the 802.11 Wi-Fi protocol. That's an IEEE standard, makes devices interoperate. But today we're talking about clinical trials. So part of the reason why IEEE is involved in the area of blockchain for clinical trials is that it aligns with our mission on advancing technology for humanity. So when we look at blockchain in this application, we're talking about enhanced patient care, the opportunity for enhanced patient care and patient safety, while optimizing the drug development process. And in this work that I do in initiative and community development, I meet people like you here, and obviously Ken from Pfizer, and Disa from UCB. So let me just give you a little introduction to our experts here. One of the great things about this particular panel we've put together, which I hope gives you some interesting insight, is that not only do they work within a pharmaceutical framework and looking at how to push innovation through the pipeline, but they also work beyond their four walls. So they're involved in public consortia and working amongst other organizations to drive the adoption of the technology. So what we're really going to try to focus is not so much why this is such a great technology and why we think it works in the clinical trials use cases, but kind of like the day-to-day motion they go through in trying to drive to get acceptance for proof of concept and pilot, and gives you a different flavor of what it's like to be in the pharma world. So as we get started, we have Ken Nassau, who is the Senior Director of Business Technology at Pfizer. He leads the Blockchain Strategy and Execution Team, which is the Center of Excellence for Blockchain at Pfizer. He's also part of the Digital Solutions and Emerging Tech Leadership Team. And next to Ken, we have Disa Lee Chun. She is Head of Innovation with the Global Clinical Sciences and Operations at UCB. She came to us from London today. She's responsible for evaluating, piloting, and implementing innovation solutions in clinical trials. She's also the leader and the initiator of the Pharma Fuse working group in blockchain healthcare, which I'm a member of, but I'm going to let her talk about it when they go through their introduction. So Ken, let's start with you and your world at Pfizer, what you're doing in and outside, and what you guys are doing there.
Sure, thanks Maria. Hi everybody. Yeah, I thought I'd start by just spending a few minutes just explaining in the clinical trial space like why we prioritize that as a high value target for us with blockchain. And it comes down to three or so different factors. First is we look at strategic value. If you're talking about emerging technology, which is still needs to be proven in many ways, you're not going to muster a lot of energy around that if it's not an area that has like a real focus for your company. And so for us at Pfizer, clinical trials are really core to what we do. In fact, it's not just a sort of a divisional imperative, it's a corporate imperative around clinical trials. And we're all about trying to speed innovative medicines to our patients. So because of that, there are people at Pfizer who are willing to innovate and try new things and break with the status quo. And so that makes it sort of fertile territory for explaining blockchain use cases. So the strategic value is like the first important factor that we consider. The second has to do with market position. People say all the time, blockchain is a team sport, and you got to think about what role you play on that team. Not everybody can be the quarterback on every team. And so we need to evaluate that, because if your position is really sort of a supporting position, you're not really going to be able to bring the ecosystem together in support of a blockchain idea. But here again, for clinical trials, as a pharmaceutical company and a large one, we run hundreds of clinical trials for which we're the sponsor. And as an industry, are responsible for most of the clinical trials that are conducted out there. So as a result, we have market influence. We can bring, people will listen as we suggest ideas and try to bring the ecosystem participants together. So sort of another check in that box. And the third factor is the really tough one about the availability of high value use cases. And here's where you have to ask those really tough questions about do you really need a blockchain to do that? And we're, full disclosure, we're still asking those questions and doing our explorations to answer those questions. But we think that there's real potential there. And that's because the things that blockchain, the problems that it solves are problems that we see all over the place with clinical trials. You've got multiple parties transacting without a lot of trust in a way that creates a lot of transactional friction today, but you need, because it's highly regulated, a high degree of auditability. So for those reasons, there's sort of a bunch of checks in those things. We feel like blockchain can really be valuable in that space. And there are a number of sort of specific use cases that we're evaluating. So just to give you a little bit on that. One is about supply chain oriented, about the clinical supply. So this is, we've got investigational products that go from manufacturing through distributors, couriers, investigators to patients. And over the course of that life cycle, we lose visibility into that, into that product today, or we have a hard time. And there's a lot of manual processes actually involved in navigating that process today. So we think blockchain could play a role in that space. Another area of interest, perhaps a little bit further out, though, is this idea of using blockchain as a way to break down some of the data silos that exist today and giving us better access to real-world evidence or real-world data and allowing patients to take ownership of their data in a way that they can permission researchers like ourselves to have access to it and create incentive systems around to encourage them to do so. So that's another use case that we're really interested in. And then third, and maybe sort of more narrowly, if we look just really into our processes, even things like the way we track biospecimens in the course of a clinical trial, today those biospecimens change a lot of hands. They go from an analytics lab to a central lab to another analytics lab, and again, over the course of that, we lose visibility or have a hard time maintaining visibility to the status of that biospecimen as it's making its journey through the clinical trial process. Then we have to reconcile all the data afterwards. So for all those reasons, we think blockchain has play in the clinical trial space. And as Maria said, we're looking at these things both internally and externally. We formed a working group about a year ago, focused in clinical R&D and bringing together about 20 different participants to then sort of evaluate which use cases feel like they could be the highest value, and then spin off a bunch of working groups to try to develop those use cases. And that's sort of where we netted out, was with that that clinical supply chain concept, where we now have about 18 different participants, including pharmaceutical companies, CROs, CMOs, et cetera, all forming around that idea. And then the last one I wanted to bring up was this consortium called the IMI, and if you're from Europe, you probably know it, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is the biggest public-private partnership in the world. And we, along with DISA and UCB and 7 other pharmaceutical companies, a total of 9 of us, have joined together to do the work, basically to lay the foundation for blockchain collaboration in healthcare. Together we'll figure out what are the most high-value use cases, what are the requirements, the data standards, and that work's going to kick off next year. So that's an overview of what we're working on.
Okay. And Disa, what about you?
Well, yes. So, hi everyone. So at UCB, we are working creating value for people living with immunology and neurological conditions, including rare diseases. So of course, one thing that we're looking at is not just innovation in the drug development itself, but it's also looking at what technologies can we bring in clinical trials and that we can explore and pilot to basically shorten that drug development process. Of course, one of the things that I started, like Maria just mentioned, is the FUSE blockchain work group. This is a nonprofit organization where it's a mixture of pharma companies, academia. We also have, of course, Maria from the IEEE, FDA members, and CROs, vendors, IT startup companies as well, cooperating with us. We started by producing a white paper to create this awareness, because what we realized is there's a lack of understanding why it's blockchain, and especially for decision makers. I mean, the people who actually would approve and provide that type of funding that we can start exploring and see how we can pilot and scale up. And right now, we're actually working on the proof of concept in different areas, especially in the patient data. And that's, yeah, it's a very exciting activity that we're doing. And of course, what Ken just mentioned, I mean, we're also involved in the IMI project. It's something that will start next year. So we're looking forward to, cooperating with the industry and see how we can, basically speed up the adoption, because I think a lot of companies, and I can maybe also speak for Pfizer, I mean, of course, we're all looking at ways that we can improve that, the data transparency, the data security, and the trust, especially the trust element, how we can share that information across the different networks and even with regulators. And the speed of the drug development, I mean, from 12 years, which is the standard, how can we cut that down to half the time? Do we want to make patients wait that long? No, of course not. So we want to see, technologies like this, and maybe even other technologies to see how we can actually shorten that time frame.
Great, thank you. So I just want to let everybody know that we're going to open the audience Q&A to all of you. So if anybody has a good question or thinks of a question, I'm just going to do a couple set of questions with the panelists, but then we'll open it up to you guys for your questions. So it's really interesting to me when I first started getting into blockchain for clinical trials with the pharma companies. One of the things that amazed me was how you guys were all willing to work with each other, right? Everybody says pharma is highly competitive, IP sensitive, heavily regulated. But now I see this spurge of working groups, consortia. There's so many popping up. So my question to you guys is, number one, what do you think are the concerns and opportunities of that happening? But at the same time, how do you guys try to envision working together so that you don't all like do the same thing, go back to the drawing board all the same way? How can you learn and share and sort of take advantage of those opportunities? Ken, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think you're right that there's both an opportunity, but also some risks associated with it. I think the opportunity is that there's a lot of smart people out there, and so through these different consortia, you've got a lot of different ideation happening, and because it's an emerging space and nobody quite knows the right answer, you've got a lot of seeds being planted, and so a lot of things potentially to grow. So I think that's a good thing, but I also have some concerns about getting sort of overextended. We don't want to say no because we don't know what the winning sort of consortium will be, and so we tend to participate in many of them. And this consortium work is really, really hard work, and very demanding. And I think any company, you're not talking about like hundreds of people that you have that could participate in these. I think you're talking about more like tens of people. And so if you get involved in many of these things, you get this sort of the challenge of spreading yourselves, I think, a little bit too thin across too many initiatives, and then your participation in any of them becomes really, really limited. I'd like to see sort of people thinking more about sort of limiting the duration of some of these consortium, where they act more like as a startup kind of capacity, where the remit of this consortium is just about incubating and generating some new ideas, but then that one shuts down and sort of refers that idea into a different consortium that's more about now sort of scaling that up for sort of commercialization, so to speak. So that way we're not like running all of these consortia indefinitely. They have a focus, and they have a start, and they have an end.
Lisa, what about you?
Yes, and I totally agree. And I can speak on behalf of Fuse. What we did was to analyze, based on the white paper that we produced, there were some different areas that we can go into. And one of them was supply chain, of course, clinical trials and patient data ID. And we're aware that, there's different consortiums, like you said, like the Ledger project, who are mainly looking at drug supply chain. So we thought, let's avoid that because we don't want to duplicate the efforts. And we have members who are part of that consortium, also part of Fuse. And we thought, let's just find a way that we can just share that experience, lessons learned, and move on from there. So the current proof of concept that we're looking at is mainly on patient data, the patient ID, the e-consent, how to do data sharing, and the architecture element. So that's one way of leveraging that experience and expertise from the different consortiums. And the one thing that we're also trying to do is with IMI is that a lot of companies are, of course, part of IMI, but also part of the work group that Pfizer started, Fuse. And again, it's trying to bring all these people together that we can share freely the information. And I think, like to your point, Maria, I think it's amazing how blockchain has basically brought a community together with the industry, and that we're sharing ideas and information without even signing a CDA or NDA, which is amazing.
It's fascinating. So I'm fortunate enough to be part of your working group and your working group and 10 others because we are the standards organization. But I think it's really important. One of the concerns that we do see is all these popping up and how we can work together. So I think it's good to have an open mind for you guys to collaborate. One of the questions I often get, and although I could never answer it because of who we are, Nonprofit Technology Association, is we see a lot of new platforms and consensus algorithms being born. People are asking me, well, what should I use? This is the use case I think I have. Now, granted that you guys are going after some specific use cases, like how do you look at to say, well, this is potentially, how do you start your due diligence? Like, this is the technology platform that we want to talk to, or this is the one we want to partner with, more like the whole evaluation process, because it can't be easy. Ken, what about you guys there?
No, yeah, it definitely is not easy, and there's so many different protocols out there. We're talking about 100 or more. Nobody even really has an accurate count of how many there are, and they're all difficult to wrap your brains around. So it's, it is a real it is a real challenge. But on the other hand, it feels like way too early. My assessment, it feels way too early to sort of declare somebody as the as the standard, or to focus all your efforts on one. It sort of feels to me like standing in 1995 and declaring Alta Vista as the winner of web search be the wrong selection, right? So I think you've got to apply like filtering functions so you kind of narrow your view down to the parts that are most relevant to you. So in my space, we're looking mostly at business-to-business sorts of networks, which would require permissioned blockchains, so we can kind of filter out all the public blockchains and protocols out there because we're focusing more on the permission use cases. And there again, like we try to, my recommendation is, figure out your points of engagement, the things that are sort of most important to you. And in that one, I feel like there's this inherent tension in all these protocols between the desire to be transparent on the one hand and also preserve privacy on the other hand, right? You need the transparency to bring trust to your network, but you need privacy in order to get anybody to play in your network. And frequently, in a business-to-business network, you're in that protocol with your competitors. And so maintaining the confidentiality of that information is really critical. So when we're doing work to evaluating a protocol, that's the lens we're taking is we don't need to understand absolutely everything, but to focus on those those key things that align to really important strategies and protections that we need and focus there.
Lisa, I know you just went through something with Fuse around this.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I think, maybe before, doing the evaluation and all that, first of all, you have to have a very solid use case and do that design thinking, from the ideation and just basically look at your use case, where the holes are, are there gaps? And, start testing it that way first, to understand, whether it's feasible. And of course, when you're doing the assessments, it's looking at, the desirability. What exactly are you trying to create? What value are you trying to create here? Start assessing that. And the feasibility, what's the likelihood that this might happen? Or what are the expertise that they may have? Or the protocol and so forth. What exactly the areas you can apply? But also looking at the viability and the scalability. What are the potential way of scaling up? Is it already something? Has it been piloted? Is it already out there in the market? What exactly can basically provide that backing that you say, okay, maybe this is a potential solution that you can take on. So I think it's not an easy thing for sure because like Maria said, we actually are going through that. Through Fuse, doing all this proof of concept. Just doing a proof of concept it's not an easy thing already. So imagine if you want to scale up, you definitely need to see, okay, what exactly are the type of solutions that you need, and also what you need internally, what type of expertise you need in-house. The developers as well, and how does that affect your architecture? Where does it sit in your architecture? Which part are you removing or replacing or keeping in order to talk to blockchain? All these interfaces that you have to apply. And of course, if it's something that we want to test in a clinical trial, where's the validation element? If you're going to use it for regulatory purposes and even provide access to regulators to your permission blockchain, how do you make sure that they trust that they have the right access, that they can see that transparency of the data? How does it flow? So those are things that you need to think of. And to be honest, it's not an easy answer. Or it's quite complicated, but you just need to ensure that you involve the right people in this process.
And I think one of the fascinating things, because I work on both projects, is that you both have the part of your proof of concept and the way how you want to follow through is that the patients are also part of the process in the sense that it's not just about conducting the trial on them, but it's about how do you give back data back to the patients. So I imagine that's also a critical part of your thinking as you go through proof of concepts because as all of you can imagine, there's probably 100 questions that come to mind as it does to me, like how is that going to work? So I think it's a really interesting point that they both share this commonality in the groups that they're working. So I think after this question, I'll open it up to you guys, but one of the things that I often hear with many groups and technologists is that there's some frustration with, especially in blockchain for clinical trials, because it seems so explosive right now, right, as an application in the pharmaceutical framework. but the frustration at the pace that the projects are progressing. Like, so if you're on POC, why isn't it going to pilot? And those who are on pilot and seem to be happy with some of the outcomes, why are they not going to the next step, right? So I guess the question is when as you go through this, what indicators are you guys looking at to say, I have enough confidence as a group, of course, right? Because we said this is a team decision. We have enough confidence that we can take it to the next level. So maybe Disa, maybe you could, since you're in the thick of it now, can talk about that.
Well, we're not at that stage yet, but I would assume that, once we are comfortable enough to say, okay, make a decision, I mean, what we would need to understand, again, it's, what type of skill sets we need internally. I mean, if you look at, the IT landscape in any companies, because our processes are complex, actually, and we have many systems in-house and also, external that we use, and, the data still sits in silos, right? So that's another problem. So just thinking about, the resource elements. If you want to scale up, you might need a similar type of number of team members potentially, because it will be, if you're bringing blockchain and have to interface with your architecture in some ways, then it might need a different skill set. So it's having that plan of, the people, first of all. Of course, the funding that you need to have. And to think about, as well, looking at the different use cases of what you could potentially replace, if any, or add to it. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's, in clinical trials, especially, I think it would take a few more years before we can actually say, okay, it's mature enough that we can move further, because it's not just down to pharma to do this, or the healthcare industry is also working with the regulators. What exactly they expect from you, what they can accept in that sense, and just having that guidance from them. It would be meaningful to involve them earlier on. And that's why we at Fuse, we definitely have some FDA members who are also collaborating with us, because that's the feedback that we need. I mean, I was in this conference where I heard one of the highest person in FDA saying, we as an industry, we have to be innovators, and also look at, not just cloud, but blockchain. And I was so happy when I heard this, but again, it's not an easy thing. I mean, it's also that shift of paradigm. It's the change management, the change culture in your company. I mean, that's not an easy activity. So those are elements that you need to kind of plan ahead and prepare the organization. So yeah, it takes time.
What about you, Ken?
Well, yeah, and I agree with all of that. I think just to make it even a little bit more, tactical here is that operations and governance, you'd have to be completely comfortable that you have that locked down before you ever turned anything into a production system, right? Because today, if your application that you've just launched turns out to have a defect or has a security risk in it, you basically go in and just patch it, right? On a blockchain, it's not going to work like that. I mean, everything that's on that blockchain is now governed by a committee, in some way, and you need to make sure that you have an endorsement about how change management is going to be done, how the change control is going to be done, and patches and defects and all that sort of stuff, as well. So I think all that has to be in place. And the other thing I think about too is not every idea is going to ultimately succeed, right? Just like in any solution pattern, it doesn't have to be blockchain. Some things ultimately won't work out. But what's your exit strategy? If the solution ends up not returning on the level of investment that you expected, how do you exit out of that? And that's very straightforward when it's a centralized solution, right? You shut it down, decommission the servers, and you just move on. But when it's a blockchain and now you have your data running on nodes and other people's data centers, it's a different story, and one that has to be considered carefully. You need to have a plan for how to do that if it gets to that point.
Excellent. Okay, so does anybody in the audience have any questions? I think we have some runners here to help us. Somebody should be coming to you with a mic. Here he comes. You're getting a workout for today.
Disa, you mentioned a few of the more qualitative issues involved in this from a talent and resource perspective, and also you mentioned change management. What are some more of those things, or do you see those two as the main thing in terms of you deciding who you bring on, whether it's a make or buy situation, and also do you see the talent available in the global marketplace of talent to do that?
Very good question. I think in general, it seems there's a lack of developers in general. That's what I see. And just talking to some of the companies, blockchain companies as well. So I think as a pharma company, we're not a technology company. We make drugs. So of course we would like to potentially partner with someone who actually has the expertise. I mean, not necessarily we would have the staff or hire the people, but it's just knowing who actually can do this type of activities or work with us. Because if you look at pharma, just as an example, in terms of clinical research, I mean, we hire and we have the partnership with clinical research organizations. I mean, they're experts in doing site monitor and all that, and we leave them to do that activity. So the same approach would be for blockchain as well. So there's a lot of startup companies who are definitely more experienced than we are, or clearly more experienced than I am, that we would like to use that expertise.
What about you, Ken? You've been looking at some of this stuff too.
Yeah, I think to your question about build versus buy, I mean, our model, and probably the same as yours, is that like you said, we're a medicines company. We don't do a lot of in-house development, so we rely on consultants and partners to do most of the development. But we try to keep internal and expertise in what's being developed, so that we know that it's right, that it meets needs. It's 21 CFR Part 11. That's industry speak. So we need to understand our solutions, even if we're not the ones who build it directly. So that requires an even higher level of skill, in this space. And actually, I recently hired a blockchain engineer, architect, and it was hard. It was hard to find somebody who had hands-on skills, so they could understand specifically, how these things are constructed, but then also had, a base of architecture skills, because blockchain doesn't exist. Like, nothing's going to get built just in blockchain. It's going to be blockchain. There's going to be elements of database. There's going to be web front ends, and there's going to be mobile clients. There's a whole lot of technologies involved here, and you need people who can understand all of that, and that's not easy to find.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Anybody else have a question? All right. Well, I have one final question. And it's, one of the things that talking to many groups and people, they always like to talk about, everybody likes to talk about success, right? When you talk about innovation, because it's so revolutionary, it's like, oh, we were successful. But you had to know there was failures along the way, right? We all know this. And one of the things at IEEE, we want people to talk about failures, not because we want people to fail, but we think that's where the opportunity for innovation will come. So I'm going to put you guys on the spot here, right? Going through these proof of concepts and pilots, what do you anticipate the failure might be? Like, where do you think we might have a setback here? And if you've anticipated that, what do you think would be, what's my plan to attack it, right? So sort of like, I'm going to go to the mall today, but the bus didn't get there, so what's my plan B, right? So I guess my question is, wish was that easy in blockchain, but it's not. But what do you guys anticipate might be that setback from the beginning, and how you think you're going to get over it? So hypothetically speaking, of course. We don't expect any failures, but I'm just saying.
Well, I'll take it first. I mean, I think we absolutely do expect failures, and I think this is to some degree, I feel comforted by our heritage in life sciences and pharmaceutical development, because we're accustomed to failures, right? I mean, most of the products in our R&D pipeline will not make it to market. So we're used to taking risks and expecting failures, and to learn from them and develop. And I think there's no real way to mitigate that, in this space. And I think if you look at the Gartner hype cycle, it predicts, a long path ahead. If we're in the peak of inflated expectations, the thing that comes after that is the trough of disillusionment. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a tough time, because a lot of things are going to fail, a lot of startups are going to fail. But on the other end of that is the plateau of enlightenment, as it's called. So I think it's going to be sort of holding on for dear life, expecting that the juice will be worth the squeeze, as they say, and that there's something that's really going to be rewarding at the end of this.
Yep. Disa, what about you?
Well, I think yes, it's definitely something that we will hopefully will not experience that very soon, but yes, it will happen. I mean, of course. I mean, but the whole point of failure is not learning from the failure, and I think that would be the biggest for me. And of course, as you mentioned, it's all about sharing the learnings as well. And I think that's the good thing about the consortiums, because even though we have the different companies doing their own pilots, I mean, sometimes there's that sharing of information. And of course, the ideal situation is that there's more sharing of it, because, you know, that's how we learn as an industry, what to do and what not to do. So, yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists. You guys were great, and I appreciate it. I hope that we shared a little bit of what it's like, a little bit in the pharma world, what we're going through right now. If you're interested, the IEEE's Blockchain for Clinical Trials adoption platform, we're trying to drive adoption of technology through standards, industry guidance, and obviously working with regulatory. But if you want to learn what DISA is doing at FUSE or what Ken is doing with the life sciences blockchain at Pfizer, the Patient Data Donation Project, please, come see us after the session. We'll be happy to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Disa.